And just as promised, everyone, and just like we were talking about, next step here, diving into these shocks and tearing them apart to retrieve that little plastic spacer out of there so we can get full travel out of our shocks. Before you attempt this, anyone, if anyone is planning on attempting this little part of the program here, make sure that you have some silicone shock oil on hand so that you can refill these shocks after you finish. Traxxas recommends a 40 weight silicone shock oil. I personally didn't have any 40 weight laying around. I did happen to have some Team Losi 32.5 weight silicone shock oil, so I just went ahead and used that to refill the shock. As far as taking these apart, everyone, I know a lot of people may be a little bit intimidated by taking these shocks apart and just the thought of bleeding the air out of the oil. And I just got to tell you guys and gals, it was a relatively easy process with these shocks. Number one, I went ahead and did this one already and pulled that little plastic sleeve out, which is sitting right down here, this little guy. That is our little plastic sleeve with a little bit of silicone oil on it there. As far as how much oil is in these shocks, everyone, not very much at all. Very little oil in here. And it seems to me, after looking at it and tearing it apart, that Traxxas probably didn't even have enough oil in here to really have to worry about bleeding to begin with. So I put a little bit more oil in here than what they had, brought it up to a little bit below the thread up here, and then, pressed it, put the cap back on and pressed it up slowly, loosened up the cap and released the air bubbles. And it seems to be working okay. I don't, not feeling any air bubbles. There's no restrictions. It's even with the spring off of there, the shock's not trying to pull itself out on its own or pull itself back in on its own. It all seems to be working just as it should. So a relatively easy task of refilling this with oil and bleeding out the air. And we're going to get started on that with this other track unit over here, which hasn't been finished yet. This one is still in its stock form, and we're going to go in here and tear this apart and get working on that. First thing that you want to do, everyone, is you're going to need a 2mm Allen wrench, and we're going to go ahead here, or a hex wrench I should say, and we're going to go ahead here and remove this screw right down here for this shock mount, or for this axle mount. And you're definitely going to want to pay attention to which way this is mounted. I would suggest, honestly, doing one at a time. That way you can have this other one sitting off to the side as a reminder as to which way everything goes back together again. So real simple, everyone. We're going to remove this screw right here, and we're going to remove this screw right here and release the shock from the mount itself. And then we'll go ahead here and start tearing apart the shock. Another thing that you might want to have handy, everyone, I'm using a disposable paper plate and a piece of paper towel on top of the paper plate just in case we need to sop up any extra oil or things of that nature. So this is my working environment, trying to keep it nice and clean. Clean paper plate, clean paper towel. That way we don't have to worry about any kind of foreign debris getting inside that shock. All right, everyone, so I got a little makeshift tripod set up over here with a selfie stick in the back of a chair. We'll go ahead here and start pulling these screws out and removing these brackets. First bracket removed, setting this off to the side. Gonna go ahead and pull off the shock. Yes, I have my track on that clean paper towel, but that is a brand new track, so I'm pretty sure it's pretty clean of debris and clear of debris. So no real worries about contaminating that paper towel. Moving our other screw and pulling out our shock itself. Alright, so now we have our shock, everybody's sitting in our hand. Next step, everyone, is I'm going to remove the spring from this little collar down here at the bottom. Sometimes easier said than done with removing this collar. Usually just release the tension on the spring and try to push that collar off to the side. If you can hold the spring tension down, it should be relatively easy to pop this collar out of here without tweaking things all out of place, which is what I'm trying to do here. That little spacer that they have in there doesn't necessarily make this the easiest of jobs. Yes, you could just unscrew the eyelet off the end of the piston there, but this is a lot easier way of going about it. So there we go. We've got that disconnected. Our next step, everyone, is going to be removing the shock cap here. And they've got that held on there pretty darn good. So you're probably going to need a small set of pliers or something along those lines. So you can get in here and hold the side of the shock body. Yes, it is notched here on either side, so you can get a good bite on it. right about in here. And we'll see how tight. See if I can get it by hand. If not, using a little scratch awl here, or an Allen wrench or something of that nature, just to put a little extra leverage on it. And there is our shock cap right there. There's a little rubber bumper on the inside there. Our little air bleeder thingamabobber. Looking on the inside, everyone, really not that much oil in here. This one actually has a little bit more oil than the last one, than the first one, to be honest with you guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let this drip out onto this paper towel. Collapse that piston down a little bit. Go. And now the next thing, everyone, is we're going to have to unscrew this eyelet off the end of the shaft here. So this is a touchy thing to do. I usually like to use a pair of wire cutters, a pair of side cutters, and using the sharp edge of the side cutters, keeping them as close to this plastic edge as possible. That way you're not going to scratch that piston right there. If you scratch that piston or put any kind of grooves on that piston, it's going to bind up on full compression, or it'll start eating away at the O-rings when it slides in. So you definitely don't want to damage that shaft. So you have to be very careful as to what you use for grabbing a hold of it to loosen up this eyelet. Currently, everyone, I'm using a pair of small needle nose pliers, which isn't necessarily the best thing to use. So I don't necessarily recommend doing that. But really, there's no other real way of getting those undone. Alright, so we have that removed. Next step, everyone, is just to slide the piston on out of here very gently. I just pushed it up as far as I could with my fingernail, and I'm going to use another piece of paper towel just to grab a hold of this top little, whatchamacallit there, that little seal. And then see if we can work the rest of this piston out without damaging anything. Sorry about that, everyone. You really can't see what's going on. I'll do this the no-no way and use that little scratch awl just to push that piston out the rest of the way. And there we go. And there's that little plastic sleeve just fell out of there at the same time. And here's what we were chasing after. Is this little guy right here, everyone. This is our plastic sleeve. And that is what's holding up the works. We've got that out of there. Just going to wipe off any excess oil that is remaining on the shock housing itself here, or the shock body. Looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and put the piston back into it. Easier said than done sometimes. There we go. We've got that back through. Easy peasy. Wipe off any excess oil that's on that piston. That way when we put our pliers back on it, or our side cutters back on it, we're not going to be slipping and sliding here. So I'm going to go ahead here and try to get a bite. I'm putting these side cutters on, these needle nose pliers on it, everyone. I'm trying to get as close to the thread as I possibly can. That way, if there is any kind of damage on that shaft, it'll be down towards the very end here, so it won't be as likely to affect the shock in any way, shape, or form. Meaning if that shaft is marred up at all by tightening this back down. Alright, so we've got that back on there, everyone. Getting a little, seems to move pretty freely there, no binding going on. Now it's just a matter of refilling this shock body with oil. Once again, I'm using some Team Losi 32 weight shock oil, which is pretty much the only shock oil that I have on hand. Now, I've got some other stuff on hand too, everyone, but it's for a T-Max or an E-Max, and it's a little bit heavier than this stuff. So I figured this would probably be the best stuff to use in this situation. So adding a little bit of shock oil to this, everyone. I'm going to keep this about... All right, everyone, barring phone calls, add a little bit of oil to the inside of the shock here, trying to keep it about a quarter of an inch away from the top of the housing here. So leaving a little bit of gap in there, which is about where Traxxas had it as well. So we're going to go ahead now and get this cap put back on it and attempt to bleed out any kind of air, if there is any air stuck inside here. So with our piston fully extended here at the very bottom, we're going to put our cap on snugly, not too tight. Just want to snug it down, everyone. Just a little snug on that thing. Then we're going to slowly, and I mean very, very slowly, push this shock up. And then as we get close to the top, what we're going to do is we're going to loosen this and bleed out some of that air. And oil is going to come out as well, so be prepared for that. And we get it up to the top, and we're going to push it back down, tighten our cap back down. And right now it seems to be pretty good, but I think we might have a little air bubble caught inside it. You can tell sometimes when you pull the shock shaft down, if the shock shaft just starts walking its way back up on its own, then there's a vacuum inside. If you push it all the way up to the top and it starts pushing itself back down, once again, there's more signs of air being inside there. So what we're going to do is we're going to push it all the way up to the top here. Well, actually, we're going to pull it all the way back down to the bottom, loosen it up slightly. We may need to add a little bit more oil to it, not too sure. We'll take a look in here. Once again, it doesn't really seem like like air is really affecting these too badly, everyone. Oil level hasn't changed at all. We're still at our same level. So we didn't lose anything out of the top. So just put a couple more drops in there just to bring it up slightly. We put our cap back on again. Tight, but not too tight. We'll slowly bring this up. And then I'm going to loosen up the cap. I'm keeping one finger underneath this shaft here to hold it in place. I'm going to loosen up this cap, and I'm going to try to push this up at the same time. There we go. Tighten it back down. Hopefully we got some air out of it. You want it to tighten down enough that you're not going to suck any air back in at the same time. Pulling the shaft out, it's not retracting, so there's no vacuum in there. Pushing it forward, and it's, well, now it's pushing itself back out a little bit, so there might be a little bit of compressed air in there. So we're going to repeat that process again, everyone. We'll slowly move this up. Not fully up. And I might have tightened this down a little bit too much. There we go. Try to loosen this back up and try to push any remaining out. Now it's not rising back up, so it looks like a good sign there. And it is pushing itself back out again. So a little bit of air in there still. Not much, very minute movement there. But there is a little bit of air in there. So what I'm going to do, everyone, is I'm going to loosen this up. And this is where you're almost better off having a little bit too much oil in there than not enough. If you have that excess oil in there, when you push the piston up to the top, and those air bubbles start coming out, you almost want those air bubbles to come out and some oil to come out along with them. That pretty much guarantees that all the air is out of the shock. Now, one problem that we have here, everyone, is that these shocks aren't the best shocks. Plastic body shock, so probably not the most airtight as far as things go. And right now, everyone, I actually might have a little bit too much oil in these things. I'll loosely put this cap back on here. Start moving this piston up slowly once again, slowly moving this piston up. And then we're going to open this baby up and see if there's any air coming out the top. Bleed off any air. There we go, we got a little bit of fluid coming out. Keeping our piston held in all the way. We don't want any, you don't want to pull that piston back, because then you're going to create a vacuum and pull air back in. So just tighten it back up again. Shock is pulled back all the way. It's not pulling itself back up, and it's not pushing itself back out. So I think right now we're good to go, everyone. This be free movement. No air bubbles caught inside. And we seem to be all right. I think one more time for craps and giggles, I'm just going to go ahead and hold this thing down and loosen up the top and see if I can get any more air to pop out of this, if I can. There we go. And I think we're okay. Wiping off any excess oil that came out from bleeding. Shock is not rising back up, not pushing back down. Seems to be pretty free moving there. So I think we're all set on that one. Just time to throw it back together. Relatively easy. I'd imagine you might want to put a little bit of torque on this cap just to make sure that she is snug back down. So we're going to go ahead here, put our pliers back on it. Give it a little twist just to make sure that she is down all the way. And then go ahead and reassemble everything, which is going to be a piece of cake, everyone. Just a matter of putting our spring back on and then putting our bottom retainer back on. Without having that plastic spacer in there, all that stuff goes back together much easier. And there is our end result. Shock is working beautifully. So we're going to go ahead here and get these shocks reinstalled back onto the track units here. Putting them back in the way that we found them. Using our other track over on the other side for a reference as far as directions and things of that nature. Tightening these screws down once again, everyone. Just want to run them in until they're snug. Don't need to over tighten these screws. Screwing into plastic, so no worries on that screw back and back out. Looking at this one over here on this side, noting the position of that clip that goes around the axle and making sure that we get this one back into that same position again. Excuse my hands and arms and everyone if they're in the way. You guys get the general idea as to what we need to do here. And this one is just not going in too smooth. There we go. Once again, you're screwing in the plastic here, everyone, so no need to over tighten anything. Get her snug back down. And if you have this part here too snug, everyone, you might actually start to pinch that little eye on the inside and make it so this part doesn't move so freely. So you don't want to over tighten that part either. You just want that snug, everyone. That way everything moves nice and free. Alright, so there we go, everyone. We've got our limiters removed from our shocks, so we now have full travel with this back shock, which is going to give us the full range of motion on the axle itself. So there we go, we got that all said and done, and just a matter of mounting the tracks on the truck, which is what we're going to move on to next.